You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club, World Affairs, and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Apart from hard and fast things like today's close of the S&P 500, the temperature today in Chicago or Dallas or Des Moines, there are things that are harder to quantify, harder to measure, intangibles. When you cover politics, the ground is littered with those intangibles: a candidate's likability, a voter's mood, or, scaled up, the national mood, a collective fantasy created, assembled, the way grains of sand make a beach, by piling up data from a couple of 100 million people taking their own emotional temperature. From 2020 to 2024, the American people watched 1 million of their neighbors die, while millions more got sick. They watched unemployment rise and the value of their retirement savings decline. People who wanted to buy a house saw the rising cost of borrowing put some homes out of reach, while countless others already in homes saw those places appreciate in a way that meant they wouldn't even be able to afford to buy the place they live in today. Slaughtered chicken flocks made eggs expensive. Supply chain problems made first animal feed, then meat expensive. Gasoline prices strained budgets for people with big vehicles or long commutes. And we ended up in a pretty sour place. So sour that even when the price of eggs went down and the price of gas went down and incomes rose, and the stock market recovered, then soared to record levels, those old bad feelings remained, creating a big opening for some politicians and an uncomfortable dance for others. They all have to play their hand with you, this huge, dissatisfied audience watching. Americans feeling bad isn't new. I've seen it for decades, but recently, I've been working on a democracy project that's taken me from large urban centers to some of America's most isolated rural communities, and I've noticed this crippling mood of pessimism is everywhere. Name the issue: public safety, unpopular foreign wars, immigration, the economy. Virtually everyone is afraid of what might happen to this country if their own candidate isn't elected, and that's deepening the chasm between the two Americas. At this point, can people even believe our problems are fixable? Or are they unalterably convinced the country simply lost its way? This is what we'll try to answer throughout this political year, whether the facts disprove our fears, by talking directly to people in communities large and small across the U.S. And every month, we're going to dive into an issue that's going to drive the 2024 presidential election in November. For this first episode of the series, we'll start with the most fundamental questions. Just why do Americans feel so bad? And is a majority right when it says the U.S. is going in the wrong direction? To begin our journey, we turn to a voter who had just cast his ballot in the Iowa Republican caucus.
Presently, I'm working 3 jobs. I'm closing my business of 30 years, and my business went through a 1,000-year flood in 2008. I went through economic ups and downs before, but now, thank God, I got my daughter through college and she's out on her own and doing well that way.
Phil Hemingway lives in Johnson County, Iowa, the only county in the state where Donald Trump didn't take home the win. Nikki Haley won Johnson County by a single vote. Like many of his fellow Americans, Phil feels like the U.S. economy just doesn't work for people like him, no matter how hard he works.
In a time when I was hoping to kick back a little bit and enjoy the fruits of my labor, I'm working 3 jobs. It hits home for me, and like I say, it was a business that I had great success with, and it's just that this inflationary period has made it impossible to maintain it. And so now I'm working for other people.
While campaigning in Pennsylvania, President Biden claimed he's been better for small businesses than his predecessor was, and that, quote, everybody's doing better. It's just beginning to sink in. But this recovery hasn't trickled down in time to save Phil's auto and truck repair shop.
I'm chief cook and bottle washer of my shop, and really I'm kind of a dinosaur that way anyway, because most shops are multiple technicians and things like that, but I just always enjoyed working by myself and have done it my whole life. So I'm kind of clinging to a model that its days have passed. But the increase in borrowing money, the hyperinflation that I'm encountering with commercial property is killing me. And I'm not in a position where I'm going to kill my customers to keep myself afloat. If things come back and I can build or find something more economical to run my business out of, I'll open it up again. But right now, I've got to shut it down and sell off.
Inflation, high taxes, and a lack of opportunity has pushed this self-identified fiscal conservative to actively campaign for new leadership, someone that'll give blue-collar America and the workers like him a break.
Well, I spoke at my caucus, and the first thing I said is the most important thing is that we get Joe Biden out of the White House. I would prefer that we get someone new, because I think the problems that we're facing is going to take more than 4 years. It's going to take someone who has the potential of being there in the office for 8 years. And I don't think our country is well served by this constant flipping back and forth from the extremes, because it seems like there's nothing in the middle. So I really feel that we've got to get new blood and change the direction of our party and change the direction of our country.
But as the prospect of a Biden-Trump rematch becomes increasingly likely next November, Phil may have to choose between what he considers two very flawed candidates.
I've held my nose to vote before, and it won't be the first time. There's a saying that tough times don't last, but tough people do. And I've experienced tough times and things of that nature, and I know that that's part of life. It's part of growth. When I was younger, they said it adds character, but I feel I've got enough character now. We can laugh about it, but I think it's more than just saying it's just a blue period or something like that. I think there's some general cynicism with the system and with government and things like that. And we need some true leaders that aren't interested in their own personal gain or their own personal egos, and are true statesmen and work for the betterment of the people of our country, everyone, not just the elites and that, but the working class and all our citizens.
Americans from the largest urban centers on the coasts to the smallest rural towns are deeply pessimistic about the state of the nation. And on both sides of the political aisle, there seems to be a disconnect between what people want and where they feel the country's headed.
I think just the whole coarseness of our society has gotten worse as the decades go by, which is unfortunate, just in the language and the way people interact with other people. But I try to be optimistic. I try to look on the bright side. I think I went to my first caucus when I was in elementary school with my parents. So yeah, if you're not involved, you got no reason or right to complain. Because if you really want change, you got to be willing to put yourself out there.
So what will it take to get the political leadership that voters like Phil Hemingway want? And are things really as bleak as people perceive them to be? To help me get to the bottom of these questions, I'm joined by Dante Chinny. Dante Chinny is a reporter, data analyst, and director of the American Communities Project at Michigan State University. The American Communities Project has embarked on a 3-year study of American fragmentation, funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I'm one of the reporters working on the project, just for full disclosure. Dante Chinny, welcome to On Shifting Ground. It's great to have you.
Well, thank you for having me in, and that's a good disclaimer to put out there.
I want to begin with the recent national surveys done for the American Communities Project. They ask a lot of interesting questions. What are the trends that you see in the data that might have surprised you or unlocked some things for you in trying to understand the country as we enter a campaign year?
I think a couple of things that jumped out of the survey were interesting. First, I think everybody knows the country feels extremely divided right now. But I was kind of surprised that we asked a series of questions about just basically agree, disagree questions, cultural questions, economic questions. And there was more agreement than I thought we'd see on some questions. A couple in particular about the economy is rigged for the rich. And everybody agreed with that question. Look, we have these 15 different community types we look at, and they're really different. They range everything from big cities and urban suburbs and college towns to rural middle America, aging farmlands. And the idea that everybody agreed on that question really surprised me. I mean, even places really that are winning, that are the winners, quote unquote, in the new economy, felt the economy was rigged for the rich. That was interesting to me. There was also something really fascinating, which was we asked people whether their lives were on the right track or wrong track, whether their community was on the right track or wrong track, and whether the country was on the right track or wrong track. Some of these communities are really struggling. They're having a harder time. They've got problems with opioids. They've got unemployment rates, though unemployment's pretty good everywhere right now, but lower household incomes, places that look like they're struggling more. Everybody agreed, over 70, I want to say 75% agreed that their lives were on the right track. Every one of these places, even when lives look a little difficult in the data. And then everybody agreed that the country was on the wrong track. So again, like these are places where they view the world very differently. Their economic circumstances are very different. And yet, on these two questions, is your life on the right track, wrong track? Is the country on the right track, wrong track? They were all in agreement. So the idea that everybody thinks the country's on the wrong track is strange, because how can that be?
Here's what jumps out at me from that. You and I have both been reporters a long time. And one of the sort of human nature tendencies that people have is to universalize their own experience, to assume that a lot of other people must feel the way they feel.
Yep.
And here we are in question after question. When asked to assess where things were at socially, politically, economically, when you drew the circle very small, things were pretty good. But then that tendency for people to universalize their own experience crumbled because they assumed that things were terrible everywhere else. My life's in pretty good shape, but it's very bad in other places.
Yeah, absolutely. I just came back from a reporting trip where we did this last week. We went to Manhattan, like New York. And we asked like 10, 15 people there, are their lives on the right track? Is the right track, wrong track? Is the country on the right track, wrong track? And then we went way out to this community called Chenango, New York, which is very small. It's about 3.5 hours north and west of New York. There's not a lot around there, frankly.
Sort of in that region near the Pennsylvania border.
Right. And I don't want to spoil too much what we're going to report, but like I got the feeling talking to people that their lives are on the right track because they felt responsible for their lives in some way. They're like, I'm where I am and I'm okay with this. I'm where I want to be. Like, these are the choices I've made. And the stuff about the country felt more like, I don't have any control over this and it's scary. I will say both places we went, and obviously Manhattan is very, very, very Democratic, and Chenango County is very Republican, less Republican than New York is Democratic, but still very Republican. And voters in these places, Democrats and Republicans, were both really scared of what happens after 2024. And that tells us that this year could be very tense, because you're talking about people thinking that, what the country is going to be, the future of the country in the broadest sense, is really hinges on what happens next November.
Speaking of elections, you were in Iowa to kick off the whole shebang. Iowa is a place that's older, whiter, more congregationally affiliated than the rest of America, especially among Republicans. But with what you know from the national surveys, taking that in your head out to Des Moines, what was the experience?
So I didn't get there. I did not get there for this election. I went through the data from the election.
Okay.
I've spent a lot of time in Iowa. So when I see election results come in from Story County or Johnson County or Sioux County, I know what those results mean a little bit. And my two big takeaways out of Iowa and going into 2024 are, first of all, nobody turned out, which is interesting. Now, my question is that a function of the cold, or is that a function of something else, a function of lack of enthusiasm? And then the other thing that really surprised me is looking at the results from Iowa. You can do this just by looking at a map at the county level. There was only one county Donald Trump didn't win. It was Johnson County, which is the home of the University of Iowa. And, Nikki Haley won it by one vote, literally by a single vote. The fact that that county was that close, that, Donald Trump has struggled in the past, even in Republican primary, with counties that are better educated, wealthier a little bit. That is the only county in the entire state that Trump didn't win. When I looked at those results, I felt like, okay, this feels like this is over. This nominating campaign is over. This is Donald Trump's Republican Party now. Now, what that means for the general, I don't know. I don't know, but we're going to have to see.
But there is also a fascinating tendency among voters from all parties, but certainly among Republican voters, to simply report that they are not feeling any of the positive trends in the economy, whether it's rising wages or dropping unemployment or the dropping price of gas. Whatever the metric you use is, Republican voters say they're not feeling it. From what you know from American Communities data and the way you're looking at the way this could all roll out now, this has implications not just for Nikki Haley and Donald Trump, but for Joe Biden and the United States as well.
This trend, I mean, we started noticing this even when Obama was president. It used to be the way the economy went led to your political convictions, and increasingly it looked like your political convictions led to what you thought the economy was doing. So if you're a Republican and there's a Democrat in the White House, then the economy wasn't good. And if you're a Democrat and there's a Republican in the White House, same thing, economy wasn't good. There are some exceptions I see in our data. These places we call the exurbs, like they're Republican, but they really are doing pretty well. And I think they complain about inflation a little bit. Now, I haven't gone deep into the data on this a little bit, but like they can't really complain about incomes. Their incomes are really pretty good. They're actually doing quite well. The places that say they're struggling the most, when I look at the data, tend to be these places that are evangelical communities, rural middle America, aging farmlands. But what this all means for the country going forward is it's discouraging because, look, if we can't agree on common definitions of reality and what's really happening in the country, I don't know how we fix anything. And I mean, that's why we started this work on fragmentation, this idea that like, look, we can all agree there are problems in this country. And that's sort of even the first thing we talked about when we got on here, talk about, the economy's rigged for the rich. Everybody thinks that. Okay, that's interesting. But then you get to the question of how do you fix that? And I think that's what's important about the work we're doing now, because the survey data are great because they tell us a lot, but it's when you go out in the field and talk to people that you understand what the numbers actually mean. And somehow you want to come away encouraged. You want to come away from these meetings feeling encouraged. And it's hard. Like when we were coming back from New York on Friday, these 2 trips to New York, I really came away feeling like, finding a common reality is going to be hard. It's going to be really hard in this country. And I think the thing we're going to have to do actually is agree that we don't agree and find some way to meet in the middle in other ways. And I think there might be a way to do that, but it looks hard to me.
That split vision of the country that we were talking about earlier was in evidence when I came back from the Ozarks. The median household income is pretty far below the national median, literally $20,000 per household below it. But it should be mentioned, the cost of living is also significantly lower as well in these places.
Yeah.
But we saw even in evangelical hubs that split vision where people reported in their home things were pretty good, but the country is definitely in a bad way. And there was a little bit of resentment, a little bit of isolation in the data where they feel like they are divorced from the rest of the national experience. And I always knew the chasm was there, but some of it is now self-imposed.
Right, exactly. It's going to be impossible to get people out of these bubbles. I'm just telling you right now, but we've got to be able to take them into other people's bubbles to at least show them that their thoughts about the other bubbles people live in are misguided as well. You go to some of these rural communities and they think like college towns are just full of like, everybody there is a communist, everybody there is a socialist. And it's just like, it's way more complicated than that. But like, that's what they've had drilled in their heads. And like the work we have to do with this project and the work that you're helping with and the work we're doing, I'm hoping, or we hope anyway, is like, we're taking people inside these bubbles. I don't know if we're going to be able to pop the bubbles. I don't know if it's not going to fix everything, but it's kind of an important first step to having any kind of understanding. And I guess that's the mission, right?
Well, part of it is when I try to noodle this myself, I think about the element of choice. You live that way. I may not want to live that way, But okay, that's great that you can live there and live the way you want to live. I don't want to live there. If these two Americas could say that to each other, that would be a lot healthier than what they're sort of hurling at each other right now.
I'm completely with you because I agree. Like, it has to be more of a live and let live. I mean, that has to be what America's about. It has to be. The problem is when you go to some of these communities, they feel that we're throwing something down their throat. And they're just like, why are you pushing that on us? And it's like, I'm not pushing anything on you. But they feel that, like, I can't escape from the world that you're pushing on me. And the weird thing is, as segregated as we've all become, there are ways around it through these phones and these digital media we have that give you not a picture of reality, but give you a picture of a sliver of reality or just a little bit of what a place is like. And then that becomes the stand-in for what that place is. And that's difficult. And I think that's making everything a lot harder.
When you talk about the unease that people are looking at 2024 with, what do you think's contributing to that? What gets us to here from the last two highly contentious, hard-fought national races?
Well, first of all, I think that people are right in that the country's changing. And like the speed of change it's growing. Things are moving more and more rapidly. I think that's fair. I'm not sure what to do about it. I'm really not sure what to do about it.
Is it even a do thing? Or just sort of baked into the cake?
It's right. It feels like it's baked into the cake now. And I feel like when you see things moving this fast, and I see them moving fast, and I think like when that happens, you feel this election as my one way to kind of have a vote and try to steer the ship in a different direction. And if I don't, this way it's going scares me, right? And that's really hard to overcome. Look, I don't think this is going to be like, we're going to have this election, we're going to have a civil war. I don't believe in any of that. I don't believe that stuff. But I do think it's going to get a little, I don't know, it's going to get a little tense over the next 6 months, a year. Like every election, and I think we're going to survive it. But like, I look at it and like, it's not going to be a lot of fun sometimes.
As a guy who's been looking at this country in the way you have for these past 2 decades, are you now in a different place from where you were when you started and maybe worried a little bit more about what that fragmentation is?
So worried is an interesting word. I don't know if I'm completely worried. I'll say this when I travel around the country now, and maybe you have this feeling too. This is a huge country. It's just gigantic. And like, I look at the country now and I wonder sometimes when I go out, like, how did we ever think this was one thing? Maybe this sounds really cynical but I don't mean it that way. I really don't. I hear people talk about the soul of America. Well, that's not the soul of America. I'm like, please stop. Okay, just stop. The United States is like 330 million people. It's urban, it's rural, it's got all suburban, it's got all these different types of place in it. Don't talk to me about the soul of America. You think you know the soul of America? Okay, go to where you went, Ray. Go to where you went. Go to like Southwestern Missouri. Then go to New York City. Then go to Chicago. Talk to different people, and you try to tell me very simply what the soul of America is. There was one thing that really surprised me in the survey was this. We asked people, true or false, yes or no, agree or disagree. Americans have more in common than is commonly believed. And in every one of these types, people said they believed that. They agreed with that question, or they agreed with that statement. That surprised me.
You noted that worried is a complicated word.
Yeah.
And yet, hearing that, the belief that we have more in common than we even commonly believe, maybe the flip side is that it's reassuring to hear that. I don't want to be a foreigner in my own country. I'm a Puerto Rican guy from Brooklyn. I grew up the way I grew up, but I feel I don't want to live in a country where I'm like a foreigner in various places I go. I'm just another American who's from a different place. And yet, for all that, I'm cheered, let's say, by the fact that people still think we have more in common than is commonly believed. At least it's a place to build from, no?
I agree. I will say, generally, looking at the survey, when the questions were about economics and fairness, and in terms of economic fairness, making sure everybody is taken care of, there were questions even among conservative communities where they leaned liberal, more liberal than I thought they were. This was very, very, very interesting. Where the stuff all fell apart was culture. When the questions turned to culture, religion, it used to be what? God, guns, and gays. Now it's like God's God, guns, and gender, right? Those things are where the country is still really divided. So I'm less worried about it in the end. Like when I say I'm not as worried about it, I think we'll find our way out of this, but it's not a simple fix. And it isn't like to say like, after we're one America after all. I mean, I'm curious what you think about that when you hear that now, we're one America after all. You go out there. Does it feel like we're one America after all?
Well, I think not so fast. But I still want to believe it.
Same here. No, I still want to believe it too. I want to believe it too. And I think there's hope. I'm not putting it that way, but it's just, I think sometimes we fall back on platitudes. Like we really are just one American family. And it's like, yeah, okay. Well, maybe we're a very big, complicated family, but it's not simple.
Dante Cini is a data and political journalist. He's the director of the American Communities Project, which is based at the Michigan State University School of Journalism. He's the co-author of the book, Our Patchwork Nation. Great to have you with us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you for having me, Ray. It's fun.
As Cini said, our self-imposed bubbles, our biases, may have become impossible to burst. I wonder if anything Dante and I talked about might have moved the needle for someone like Phil. So in the future, we're going to revisit him, see how he's doing, and find out if anything from this conversation changed his mind, and whether he thinks we found some common ground. We'll bring you his update on our next election episode. You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, will our frustrations with political leadership force action for change? Or have we already grown too far apart? Writers Anne Applebaum and Ian Bremmer weigh in on what it will take to make Americans care again. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. How Americans are feeling about our country's future is a complicated story, but there's a clear plot line. Everyone agrees that there is a problem, sure, but we seemingly all disagree about what exactly the problems are and why we're in this mess. How do Americans of all political stripes go about getting on the same page again? Is the problem purely political, or does the issue of our democracy's fragility run much deeper? A problem that's rooted in how we each come to conclusions about the state of the country. I hope you'll indulge me a moment for a chapter from U.S. history. After America fended off the British attacks of the War of 1812 and bought itself what felt like some breathing room to develop as a nation, the country embarked on what came to be known as the Era of Good Feelings. It lasted less than 20 years, but it's a name that now, 200 years later, might sound almost Pollyanna-ish. Can you imagine calling any recent time in America by a similar name? As I read social science data and polling and economic statistics, watch the snarly traffic on social media and the simple-mindedness of so much mass media, I wonder if we're not now in the era of bad feelings. Bad feelings that feed on themselves, that look impermeable, non-negotiable, and in a lot of ways justified. My guests have been thinking and writing and talking about what we're like at the moment, 9 months and change from a national election. So I think that might have teed them up. Anne Applebaum joins us now, Pulitzer Prize winner, author most recently of The Twilight of Democracy, and a staff writer for The Atlantic, and Ian Bremmer, founder and president of the Eurasia Group, author of The Power of Crisis, and a professor at Columbia University's School of International and Political Affairs. Anne and Ian, I'd like to begin with all the challenges the U.S. faces around the world, but more importantly, is there one brewing here at home that we can't ignore, and how would you define it?
The way we have defined it, we look at the risks in the world, around the world every year at the beginning of January. We've done it for decades now. This year, we described our top risk as the United States versus itself. We have these wars between Israel and Hamas and Russia and Ukraine. but this is perhaps the most impactful war. Not a violent war, at least hopefully not one we're expecting, but nonetheless a war of disinformation, a war of tribes, a war where the people involved see each other as a principal enemy, where there's no efforts to resolve it diplomatically. There doesn't seem to be any near off-ramp, and one that has huge impact, not just for the future of democracy, but for the future of the way we think about our geopolitical order.
Anne?
I would add to that we are also at risk of losing faith in the idea of America. And we are really a unique nation in this sense that we are not bound by ethnicity. We are not bound by blood. We are, to some extent, bound by history, but people come to the United States with very different histories and pasts. We are not even bound by a sense of place. We're a nation of people who move around a lot. The one thing that has bound us together is an amorphous idea. And sometimes the idea was really more aspirational than real. It was an idea about democracy. It was an idea about freedom. It was an idea that there were great things we could do together. Sometimes it was an idea about exceptionalism. America is the greatest nation or the best nation, or sometimes almost the opposite, that America is a nation that constantly needs work. But nevertheless, there was a sense that people of the various different tribes and of the various different ethnic backgrounds and the different geographies were working together with that idea in common. And it feels now like that's gone, that people have a very different idea of what it means to be American. They have different goals for the country. They now have radically different ideas about what America should do in the world. And you have this profound sense, I think, of disappointment. People are disappointed with what the United States is. They would like it to be something different. And in that disappointment, they no longer see the value of working together to build something. And that, I think, is, as Ian said, that's the greatest risk, that we lose that common sense of purpose.
And is there something more than the normal ebb and flow, the commas, colons, and ellipses that nations go through, good times and bad times? Is there something different about now?
So it's funny, if you look back into American history, you can find other moments like this one. So this isn't unique. And of course, horrifyingly, if you read the history of the years leading up to the Civil War, it feels a lot like what we're living in now, where you have very different ideas about the direction the country should go in. You have violent clashes. You have really angry rhetoric. And then eventually you have one part of the country saying, we don't even want to be in this anymore. So it's not unique in the history of the United States. It's unique, I would say, in the history of the post-war period. The United States has just been through, if you look back over the last 100 years, a period of really extraordinary success, starting from 1945, and then somehow emphasized and accelerated by 1989, when you had the collapse of communism and this brief feeling that our political system was somehow the best or somehow inevitable. This was the moment of Frank Fukuyama's famous essay, History is Over. And even though he didn't really write that, the reason why that idea became so popular was because people wanted it to be true and they felt it was true. We'd achieved something stable. And I think what happened in the last several decades was that we forgot that democracy is not inevitable, that nothing is forever, and that nations and political projects require constant work. And people stopped working on the idea of the United States. And I think that's the result we have now. So it's not unique in our history, but it's unique for all of us, for everybody who's been alive in the last 60 or 70 years.
Ian, for years covering campaigns, I had consultants and party pros and analysts tell me that for Americans, optimism sells, that gloomy and pessimistic candidates lose, that voters bite on hope. And when I watched the recent Republican primary debates unfold over the last several months, I figured these people are getting very different advice or have a very different theory of what to tell voters. But it wasn't that optimism sells. It was a very dire, very dreary view of the country we've become.
Yeah, and we have to ask ourselves why that is. Clearly, inequality in the United States has been growing, and we've been talking about this for decades, how the middle classes and working classes in advanced industrial democracies were getting hollowed out by free trade and automation, and they got angry as a consequence. And then we looked at how demographics have changed, and people feel like the country's not theirs anymore, and you can weaponize that. These people are getting opportunities, but what about me? What about the white, comparatively undereducated or even reasonably well-educated, but don't feel like the country's mine anymore? So that's a piece of it too. But those things are happening in other countries too, not just the US. So you have to ask, why is it uniquely challenging in the US? Why have we gone into an environment where the US feels so much more ennui, so much more politically broken, as Anne says, so much more willingness to say we don't know what our country stands for anymore, fundamentally questioning it? And if I had to point to one issue, I'd think about how nurture is going away and is being replaced in the US by algorithm to a much greater extent than any other country. We've seen over the last decades that it's not just belief in our political institutions that have eroded. It's also our media. It's also our public school system. It's also the church. It's all of these institutions that surround individual human beings and help to make us into civic-minded adults that you and I and Anne, we grew up with. We grew up with Little League, and we grew up with junior achievement. We grew up with a public school system and even a less atomized family. And as church membership is going down and community institutions are falling away, for a while they weren't getting replaced by anything, but now they are. Now they're being replaced by algorithms that are the way that we interact with other people through our smartphones, the way we get our information. And that actually is not driven by optimism at all. That's driven by polarization and like for like and anger and fear. And that is exactly what the successful anti-establishment candidates are tapping into. This is a very complex challenge, but for me, the single biggest thing that's been happening since I was a kid to when I'm an adult today in the United States is that.
And you've been writing and talking a lot about how people form their impressions of what's going on. The U.S. came out of the pandemic slowly but steadily. We may not be doing great, but there's a lot of foundation stones on which to build whatever's coming next. Yet the story we seem to be telling ourselves is different in content, in tone, of decline and disarray, of inability to act, inability to make common cause. What do you make of all of that?
Here, I'm going to agree with Ian. I've also written extensively about how social media changes perceptions, but also how it sets the rules for discourse. In the olden days, the rules for democracy were created by the rules of a parliament. Somebody is allowed to speak, and then the next person is allowed to speak. There's a set of agreements about how we come to an agreement and so on. The rules for discourse now are completely different. They're not based on the idea that we should somehow create a consensus. They're now rules that are set by social media companies in order to make money. And their money-making system requires that we stay online as long as possible. And the way that we are kept online is through, as Ian said, division, anger, emotion. It's also incredibly compelling in a way that watching a parliament debate or even watching an old-fashioned television debate is not. It draws us in. It's tailored to us so that the issues that are offered up in an emotional way are ones that the algorithm knows we care a lot about. And that has created a kind of false reality that is more real than the real reality. So the version of America that you see on your social media, which, by the way, is different from everybody else's social media, is more real and more interesting and fills you with more emotion than what happens when you walk outside and walk down the street. And that, I think, is an enormous change that none of us have quite got used to yet.
And is this no longer an argument between left and right? The fact remains there are now disturbingly large numbers of Americans who are ready to say, well, we did that. We did that for a long time, and it may have even worked, but no longer appropriate to the era. You've got to have somebody in charge. Is democracy something that we're flirting with giving up on?
The old meanings of left and right have now disappeared completely. all the things we once associated with the right, small government, aggressive foreign policy, however you want to characterize it, all the things we once associated with the left, many of those things are also gone. I wouldn't say the parties have switched places. I would just say that the nature of the political debate has changed. And you are right that it has changed now into a line that divides between people who still believe in democracy and who still believe in the rule of law and people who are willing to dismiss it. And yes, I do think that there is a significant number of people in the United States, especially among younger people, who aren't entranced or appealed to by the idea of democracy and are perfectly willing to discard it or try something new, as you say. The previous part of our conversation where we were talking about this image of catastrophe and chaos and so on that people live in, I think that's the explanation for it. Because when you live in a situation where all around you everything is burning, where violence is possible, where things are falling apart, then yes, you need a strong man to come in and take over. Throughout history, if you look at after a moment of chaos in any given society, you very often have the emergence of a dictator, whether it's Napoleon emerging out of the French Revolution or Hitler emerging out of the chaos in Germany in the 1930s. And you have a moment like that now in the United States, where because people believe we live in this crisis, because they're convinced that something apocalyptic is about to happen, they feel the need for someone who can pull everyone together. And I think it's also a need for silence. People are bothered by this constant back and forth, and people are irritated by partisanship. And again, polling and psychological study and so on backs this up. There are some people who don't like the idea of cacophony and loud noise of partisan debate. And those people in particular would like everyone to just shut up, put one person in charge, eliminate all this other stuff, forget separation of powers or balancing out, and just have one person decide everything. And yes, I do think we are at a moment when a significant number of Americans, whether they know it or not, whether they would use that language or not, would be fine with that outcome.
Ian, do you agree? Are large numbers of us now ready to at least loosen our grip on that whole consent of the governed thing?
I'd put it a little differently. Most Trump supporters are looking for someone who is most capable of taking the fight against who they see as a common enemy, whatever the them is. And Trump, whatever you think about his morals, about his alleged crimes, about his background, about his values, there's no question in my mind that he is more effective and willing to take the fight against the enemies than anybody else. Everyone else is a sad and shallow second to that. So if you're angry and you feel like there are a group of political actors that are wronging you and you want them hurt and punished and maybe even broken, then Trump is your guy. And that is the nature of a grievance-based campaign. And that's why I think the GOP has become his party. He's going to get the nomination, and there's a pretty good chance he's going to win. Right now, I don't have high confidence. We're 10 months away. Anything can happen, and probably a lot of things will because it's such an volatile and uncertain environment. But if you made me bet right now, Ray, I'd say 60% likelihood Trump actually wins. Even if I'm wrong, you can't say it's 20. It ain't 20. We know it can happen, and it can happen in an enormously uncertain global environment and also a very different domestic environment. In 2016, Trump wasn't driven by vindictiveness and revenge. 2024, he's probably going to be convicted before he's president in Washington, D.C. He's going to need to undo those investigations, those indictments. He's going to need to politicize the Department of Justice, the FBI, the IRS. And as a matter of top priority, he's going to be going after his political enemies. That will have a chilling effect in this environment on what it means to be able to speak freely about your political views, what it means to be a legitimate political opposition, how one can engage in a country with rule of law. I think that's a really big deal, and it might well be permanent damage to the U.S. political system. That's what I think we're talking about here.
And yet, Anne, in the Kenner Lecture at Lehigh University, while you gave a pretty sobering portrait of the state of play, I found it also shot through with idealism and a kind of reassurance that even given what Ian just said, things can get turned around, things can get better. that hope and confidence are ingredients in doing that. And I got to tell you, it was cheering to see Anne, the chronicler of the Soviet Gulag, someone ringing the alarm bells about the way disinformation is eating away at our institutions, speak up for hope.
There's always hope. And not only that, I feel professionally obligated to present hope, because who am I to tell younger people that everything's finished and it's all over? I mean, it's never all over. Everything that happens tomorrow depends on what we do today. In fact, I think one of the great mistakes we made over the last several decades was our assumption that democracy is inevitable and American power is inevitable and the transatlantic alliance is inevitable. We don't have to really work on these things because the arc of history is bent in such a way that they'll always be there. But equally, there's nothing inevitable about Trump winning. There's nothing inevitable about if he wins, America slides into dictatorship. There's nothing inevitable about loss or damage of any kind. And announcing that we can't cope with it, it's too much, and I'm in despair, that's what the authoritarians want you to do. That's what authoritarian propaganda is designed to do. It's designed to make people feel nihilistic, to make people feel incapable, and to make people apathetic. That's what Putin does in his language. That's what Trump does in his language. I will fix it. I can take care of it. You don't have to do anything. And a healthy democracy, or even a democracy that would like to become healthy again, requires, not just people in politics and not just people in journalism, but ordinary people to say, what can I do and how can I contribute?
I'm hopeful too, but going back to the original part of our conversation of why this is happening, if we're not addressing the underlying reasons, it's very unlikely that people are going to engage in the constructive ways that we would like, that we would hope for. Now, I've been very pleased to see that we in the United States are starting to invest meaningfully in hard infrastructure again. All of that is good. We are not investing in civic infrastructure. We are not investing in the institutions that have eroded around us that make people no longer believe in the values of society, become Americans that believe in something that we can all be proud of. We don't have any sense of mandatory civic obligations or duty. Give people a year, young people, where they serve together in some kind of public good and engage together. I mean, the Israelis, of course, do this in the armed forces, young men and young women. It stays with them for life, but it doesn't have to be the military. It can be anything. The point is we don't do that. We're not investing in the soft institutions that actually create the firmament, that make us stewards, that make us good parents, that make us think about the next generation. We're not doing that at all.
I sometimes wonder if our abundant confidence as a people might have had a downside. I grew up as part of a generation, a Cold War kid, on the idea that the United States just wasn't like other places, that whole rise and fall in history, that we weren't subject to the law of gravity like other places in the world. It was kind of crazy, but looking back on it, I wonder if it was useful, or did it leave us kind of blinded to the bad things that can and do happen to nations and their people?
So this is what I meant by inevitability. We had this feeling that democracy was something like water coming out of the tap. You didn't actually have to do anything. If you needed water, you switch the tap, it comes out. You don't have to go to the well and walk 100 miles in order to get it and put it in a bucket. And you don't have to think about where the water comes from. And democracy became this kind of backdrop. It's something that professionals did. And Joan Didion once wrote very brilliantly about this, that she once went on a presidential plane and people were surprised to see her there. She was a fiction writer. What are you doing here? This is not your thing. So you needed some kind of expertise to do politics, and everybody else maybe showed up to vote every 4 years. Otherwise didn't have to worry about it. They could go off and do business or make money or paint paintings or whatever. And I think rediscovering the idea that actually Americans had for a lot of their history, and that many other democracies still have, that democracy is fragile and that the freedom that it guarantees is always in danger. And that if you don't do something about it, whether it's rebuilding the infrastructure or participating in local politics, we simply need to understand that if we don't participate, we can lose it.
Ian, take us home. Did we do ourselves a favor with that "we can do anything, we're Americans" idea?
I used to love those polls that showed that the average American, like 90% of them, thought that they could be in the top 10% or 1% of earners over the course of their lifetime. This is incredible intrinsic enthusiasm that was really aligned with the American dream. The people came here and you built it. And the United States was the most powerful country in the world and provided unique opportunities that you would not have anywhere else. There was a massive amount of upward mobility. I think that was a great thing for the American people to have that level of enthusiasm. But the government has to perform in order for that enthusiasm to bear out. The social contract has to work. We can't forget about the well-being of the average Americans. We have to continue to invest in rural areas. We have to invest in opportunities for upward mobility. We can't allow our institutions to become sclerotic and controlled by powerful, wealthy people. We can't allow money to determine access to opportunities. So if you're going to have that level of optimism and enthusiasm in your country, you've got to actually be ensuring that it bears out, at least in part, in reality. And that failure over the course of a couple of generations is starting to bear real consequences on our society.
Ian Bremmer is the founder and president of the Eurasia Group and G0 Media. His most recent book is The Power of Crisis. Good to talk to you, Ian.
You too.
And Ann Applebaum is a staff writer for The Atlantic. Her latest book is The Twilight of Democracy. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
As a reminder, this is our first episode in a year-long election series. Next month, with the second anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine around the corner, we'll look at why foreign policy takes a back seat during campaigns. How much of a role will it play in this coming presidential election? You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Sienna Barnes, Elise Manukian, and Matteo Schimpf. A special thanks to Holly Hart from KICI in Iowa City. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.